Hello, good morning, and welcome to this ISTEC Distinguished Lecture this morning. My name is Edwin Chong. I'm the director of ISTEC. ISTEC, for those of you who don't know, is the Information Science and Technology Center here at CSU, university-wide organization covering all aspects of information sciences and technology with representatives from every college of the university. We hold many activities, including research retreats, outreach to high school students, educational efforts such as our Information Science and Technology minor, and of great interest, the Distinguished Lecture series that we have every semester. So welcome to this. Today we are very fortunate to have a very distinguished guest to deliver our lecture, but to introduce our guest, I'm going to ask Professor Louis Scharf from mathematics to introduce the speaker.
Thank you, Edwin. When you're born into a family of heroes, expectations are very high. And in this case, they've been met, maybe even exceeded. Al Hero is in our community of signal processing people, machine learners, statisticians. There's nobody with a more comprehensive, deeper, broader understanding of the theory and practice of statistical inference on random data. He's won every award you can win in the Signal Processing Society, including the Technical Achievement and Society Awards. I'm sure you've won awards I'm not aware of. Since graduating from Princeton, when he graduated from Princeton, he joined the faculty at the University of Michigan in electrical and computer engineering. He now holds joint appointments in biomedical engineering, statistics, electrical engineering, and computer science. He is a university distinguished professor at the University of Michigan, and he co-directs MIDAS, which is the Michigan Institute for Data Science. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Al back to Fort Collins. Al.
Thank you, Louis, for that nice introduction. My name is Hero. That was my father's name, and it goes back to my great-great-grandfather. But before that, his name was Heroi. And so Hero does not have the historical connotation that Louis was implying. Heroi, as it's pronounced in Swedish, and there's an umlaut on the O, simply means the person from the island of Oi, which is off of the coast of Sweden. So, but nonetheless, I greatly appreciate the attempt to magnify my importance. So I'm going to talk now in this short, 50 minutes? What's the, for now? Okay. About primarily the evolution and creation of the data science initiative at Michigan. And I prepared a set of slides that you're all going to see looks a little bit, well, probably a lot Michigan-centric. And there's a reason for that, and that's simply that in gathering data for this talk to make my points, a lot easier to gather data from my institution than to go out and try to find the equivalent statistics on data from other institutions. I view that as a very important point because one of the prime hindrances to the continued growth and health of the field of data science and associated fields of mathematics and engineering and statistics and information sciences is precisely this siloization of data on different campuses. So I think maybe when you look at what I'm going to say and all the examples I'm going to be giving, about the need that's emerging for a science of complex data, that you will interpret it as a Michigan-centric presentation, but with implications that extend across the globe. So I'm going to first talk about sort of the fundamental salesmanship that originated from some of the hype back in the late 2000s about data science, and try to explain in simplified terms with some specific examples of what I think they were attempting to capture, and then give some examples of this massive undertaking that we're faced with increasing complexity of data. And then I'll launch into some of the principles that we've been constructing in our approach to try to both federate and define data science on our campus. And then talk about a few foundational principles with an emphasis not on trying to give sort of an exhaustive list of all of the methodological principles that would be applicable or important to data science, but more from the point of view of the interdisciplinary nature and how that comes into training students to be effective in this new field. And we just launched a year and a half ago, a data science undergraduate degree at Michigan, and we'll see how that goes. We don't have data yet to really. I don't have data to show you, but I think that these types of issues are just as important as the research issues of what constitutes data science. And then I'm going to, if I have time, I'm going to give you just a snippet of some of the research that I've done that attempts to systematize the treatment of highly complex data mining problem, graph mining, with some views towards both some of the holes in the theory that we have available to do graph mining with confidence, that we're not getting a lot of false alarms or false positives, and yet have a scalable framework for developing algorithms for graph mining as a sort of a poster child for some of the points I'm trying to make on data science of complex objects. Okay, so all right, so these are the 4 V's as originally proposed, actually 3 of them, the first few, volume, variety, velocity, of complex data, of data science, originally proposed by Doug Delaney, who was basically a consultant at Gartner Incorporated in 2001. He wrote this nice paper which sort of laid out the physical properties like we have in physics of mass, energy, momentum, entropy, all sort of have their analogies in data in terms of the volume, the variety, the velocity, and the veracity of data. Each one of these categories comes with its own challenges because as you look at growing volume of data, it puts challenges on just being able to compute on the entire data set, right? So just from the point of view of being able to federate all the data into one place, or even parts of the data that are relevant to the decision that you're trying to make on the basis of what the data is saying about markets or about weather patterns or about behavior patterns of populations. And so data at volume is a problem of having sufficient a sufficient amount of space and algorithmic power to handle very large computational challenges of high volume data. Variety is, I think, a more important aspect because, taking the data that we have today and just increasing it, that's a sort of a linear extrapolation problem. You just have to make faster and faster computers, larger memories, better ways of doing distributed database and computation. Hadoop and Spark are chasing that problem already. Variety is one of the more challenging problems because of the incredible heterogeneity of the data that is being denoted big data, or in this era where there's a sort of a frenzy by especially business to make use of all kinds of different dimensions of their markets that go from a clickstream data of potential customers clicking on web pages to cookies that are in their computers to behavior patterns of people that happen to live in similar demographic regions of the country and quantitative data of behaviors, buying behaviors on Amazon of products. So putting all of this data together is a challenge that we really haven't developed the tools necessary to meet that challenge at this time. And I'll try to give a little more examples of this as we go with specifically unstructured data, which is data that has not yet been put into an Excel file. You can look at it that way because of the fact that it's so either voluminous or heterogeneous that it's difficult to correlate the different components to define a list that makes sense in terms of using these heterogeneous data types for decision making. Velocity is simply the growing amount of data in motion, wearables that are increasingly becoming part of our existence. Fitbits and smartphones that are measuring our position, and accelerometers that measure our activity levels and so forth, that leads to streaming data. So data that signal processing and statistical multivariate analysis have tried to respond to, but more specifically signal processing in terms of real-time computation and dealing with the tremendous amount of data coming off of these devices. And then finally, I think from my perspective, the most important part of these 4 V's is veracity, which is the entropy, right, of physics, that you can never be absolutely sure of the provenance of your data, the reliability of your data, or there may be lots of missing data that is distributed non-uniformly in each dimension that can affect your ability to use the data in a way that you're confident of the predictions that might come out from analyzing customer data or physical data. And some of these examples that I give, an iPhone provides GPS for positioning, but there's about an 8-meter uncertainty in that position. So that's an intrinsic uncertainty that's not usually accounted for in the plain vanilla methods of analysis that extends also to surveys. When you look at electronic surveys, the average response rate is 25%. So these are email surveys. That can be compared to phone surveys where the response rate is only about 10 to 15%. So the classic survey instruments where you have to phone a randomized sample of the population have only a 10 to 15% response rate. So there's a tremendous uncertainty in the other 85 to 90% of the population who aren't responding. Are they represented by this small 10 to 15%? well, that's an issue that has to be addressed through some statistical modeling, perhaps, some attempt to try and develop an unbiased sample, and perhaps bringing in a secondary relational types of survey instruments like Facebook and Twitter and other passive survey components. And then finally, this statistic that I pulled from this reference, IBM, which is a very interesting reference for people that are interested in this, was a surprise to me. That was stated that only about 1 out of 3 decision makers at the board level, the chairman of the board level, trust their data, trust the source of data. So this veracity issue is one which brings directly the need to bring in statistical models to help to provide a signal or a flag or a confidence interval on some of these data components that we develop in an algorithmic analysis. Yeah.
So the question is, decision makers, do they trust the data or do they trust the analysis of the data?
No, it's the data itself. Yeah, yeah. So they don't trust the raw data that comes out of either marketing or out of inventory. They just don't trust the data because
Even in their own firms.
even in their own firms. Yeah, yeah. It's because of the fact that there's inadequate sampling. Typically, there's this is for large companies with big boards. At IBM, this IBM report has some examples in it that by sector, which show that there's this level of uncertainty, this is the time bomb, right? If we fail to develop a science of complex data, then we're going to lose more and more confidence in using that data. And of course, if they don't trust the data, they're not going to trust the analysis either. Right? All right, so some specific examples: unstructured data like electronic health records. It poses lots of issues. At the minimum, most of these records, at least historically, have been taken by hand. A doctor fills out some forms. Increasingly, over the past 10 years, there are computer entry forms with particular codes for diagnostic purposes. But there's a tremendous variety of data here, which includes things like test results, osculation, and results that are qualitative as opposed to being quantitative in interviewing the patient. And it's a tremendous amount of data. The U of M health system, we have about 5 million unique patient records with this unstructured data that hasn't all been digitized or analyzed. And it raises lots of good opportunities for doing that analysis in order to develop personalized treatments or personalized methods for diagnosing different categories of patients. It can perhaps be done with statistical methods or data exploitation methods like clustering. Electronic sensor data is another unstructured modality, and we at Michigan have this M-City sort of mock-up of a city to test autonomous vehicles, which are increasingly becoming of importance in the industry. Ford announced last year that they were no longer an automotive company; they were a mobility company. And what they meant, I think, as much as we can read into their reports, is that they're increasingly launching into using data to determine multimodal modes of providing mobility to populations, for example, that don't have ready access to public transportation. So, for providing mobility through autonomous vehicles, where you might have the last mile is an Uber-like shuttle. The intervening transportation modes might be bus or train or what have you. Yeah. Bill? Nothing recorded? Or the battery's out? Yeah. Oh, yeah. 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 Maybe you can replace it. I'll just continue on. My voice sounds less loud. Okay, well, okay, and so then there's the Institute for Social Research that generates lots of economic and financial data that is like the Economic Consumer Expectation Index that is used by many financial, economic, governmental agencies, non-governmental organizations to try and predict trends. Lots of data there. We have a really interesting project going on called the Open Tree of Life, where Stephanie Smith, who's in the evolutionary biology department, has basically mapped out using two to 3 million species, their genetic sequencing, the open tree of life of all these species that relates in a phylogenetic tree all the species to each other, to a proto-species in that primeval soup that presumably existed millions of years ago. And social media, of course, is a very active area, increasingly used by students as contrasted to face-to-face communication. Students are, Twittering and Facebooking and using other types of social media to increase their network, increase the use of their network. And then, of course, image and video is another example. So other examples are include the real-time constraints. We have a project going on at the Emergency Medicine where there's a clinician, MD, who is convinced that one can make the ICU much more healthy for patients by automating the tremendous number of different types of signals, EKG signals and blood volume and so forth. Is this, I think, middle of the shirt? Yeah. Okay. Then it shifts. Yeah. You're right here. Yeah. How's this? All right. Great. I like a prescriptive audience. That's good.
Please do that in the future for all these things.
I think you just have to sit in the second row every time. That's good. And so we have a substantial activity in air pollution monitoring, which really points to the social impact of data science, where in Flint, Michigan, where there was a big lead pollution issue that I'm sure all of you have heard about. We have a set of students in our Michigan Data Science Team project who have gone out and helped the National Guardsmen and other volunteers collect data and analyze data to help predict where the next interviews or soil samples or pipe retrofitting with non-lead pipes should occur within the city of Flint. And that also occurs for the algae blooms in Lake Erie, which shut down the water supply in Toledo in 2014. Based on data collection, boats that are sent out into Lake Erie to collect algae statistics, one can perhaps predict using students or outside students might be starting sort of an uncontrolled growth cycle that can use to predict these types of problems in the future. Integrated personal omics profiles, which I'll talk about a little later as part of our work in trying to develop data-driven predictive health and disease algorithms, and then epidemic monitoring, obesity and smoking cessation that uses smartphones to basically using something called reinforcement learning to be able to learn just where that sweet spot is for giving a nice suggestive signal to somebody who wants to lose weight of when they should be maybe getting up and smelling the flowers, or going and walking around for 10 minutes. Of course, that's a data science problem, because if you give that signal too often, the person's going to ignore it. If you don't give it often enough, the person's not going to lose weight. And so you have to basically optimize an algorithm based on the person's activity level and their desire to lose weight with your ability to make these sort of suggestions on the fly. And now this is only increasing at an exponential rate in material science. The Cambridge Structural Database is a database of 40,000 new crystal structures every year. Now it's up to about 900,000 structures that are used for material science, designing new types of materials, shortening the design cycle from 10 to 15 years for new materials down to 2 or 3 years, which can have an impact, of course, on sustainability, energy, lighter materials for aircraft and so forth. The Material Genome Initiative is, of course, one of the poster childs for this. Social media has been increasing at a very high rate as well. The repositories of data has this exponential-like increase, and we can only expect this to grow over time. And these are just some other examples, which I won't bother going through. There's also an information explosion in the tools, the toolboxes that have been made available. Many of them open source. These are all the open source toolboxes that I collected when I was preparing the talk. That until recently seemed to be increasing linearly, and now it seems to be going on an exponential or at least superlinear slope. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, if the data is increasing exponentially in volume, should the number of techniques to evaluate that data also be increasing exponentially? Probably not. I mean, I think that's probably the wrong direction. We're looking to, probably make this with a foundational approach, a few reliable algorithms and software packages that can handle the majority of data sources. So handling data at a large scale is a real issue. And when, if you're the analyst or the student, trying to develop some methods for analyzing lots of data, you don't want to be in this situation. But increasingly we are. Okay, so how do we approach sort of managing to extract important information that can be acted upon or that yields insights into the generating mechanism of the data? Of course, the physical world is what we're primarily interested in. We're interested in the actual buying habits of potential customers and not necessarily their previous habits and their friends on Facebook's habits. Well, we need a data science to handle this. And so data science can kind of be on one level split into sort of 4 areas of data collection, which deals with which sources of data are the most relevant to the end user. So what's the ultimate value to the end user? If there's so much data, you can't possibly use it all. Which parts of it are going to be the most informative? And then, of course, likely the sources that will be the most informative won't be commensurate. You may have data that's from EKG in an ICU, but also demographic data and patient history, in addition to perhaps family history. So a tree, a graph, right, of susceptibility in addition to perhaps sequencing information on that patient. So you have to fuse the data from diverse sources. The management of that data, of course, is another issue of annotation and storage, security, maintaining privacy, especially of medical data, and verifying the provenance and veracity is intrinsically difficult to do. And then data analysis, which is part of the foundational approaches that we're interested in, is summarization, visualization, analysis, and ultimately falls into the category, if you're an engineer like I am, of designing a pipeline. Right? What is the pipeline of analysis techniques that one should be aware of to analyze and to handle these various components of collection and management? So the epistemology of data science, basically the theory of what knowledge base data science is built upon. It's built on principles and methods. And these principles and methods deal with taking complex data, somehow handling this high volume and variety by using a sieve to filter out relevant information that can then be put into a pipeline for analysis to perhaps design an evacuation scheme. If you saw the video, I won't bother running it again, but evacuation scheme for a floodplain in a city that can take advantage of the fact that you have prior statistics on time of day, where congestion occurs, what behaviors of different drivers are, different types of conditions that could determine the effectiveness of an emergency evacuation. Is just one example of this that comes from some work of a colleague of mine in the Department of Industrial and Operations Research Engineering. So I mentioned pipeline. So it's helpful to me anyway to try to get my head around what constitutes a pipeline for handling this complex data. Sort of look back. This in time, 1995 was the data mining pipeline sort of concept that was proposed in this came from a paper in Knowledge Discovery, KDD, which reveals, I think, when you look at the intervening 20 years, how much things have changed. You had in 1996, you had data sources. These might be, weather. It might be data coming from surveys, data that came from inventory, stock market, published reports, end-of-year reports by corporations. It was of a volume which was small enough so that you could store it all at one location. Centralized database access. The data was fairly small, homogeneous in many cases, and it could be structured as a simple list. And then data mining, which was the the lingo for what there is now called analytics, data science analytics. I don't like that word. Just an effort to rebrand data mining and statistics and signal processing and mathematical models. But these algorithms were relatively primitive, right? Basically looking at things like relative frequencies of seeing a particular salary levels. Let's say if you're trying to analyze economic growth in a particular sector and its effect on median income. It's history. It's a histogram, and we have much more sophisticated methods today for analyzing data. And a pipeline that we might consider today would look more like this, where you have some local data storage, but it's certainly not enough to store all the relevant data to the decisions that you want to draw from that data or communicate at least information to a decision maker that's in a visually interpretable form. And you have to use the cloud services to access your data through Dropbox or SkyDrive or any of these service providers. And then for real-time sensing data, which is of streaming type, it's a constant struggle, constant overload of keeping up with the data stream. So data acquisition has to account for these very different sources of data, some of which are static, others are dynamic. There's then information extraction and cleaning, which is, from my experience, and is widely acknowledged in the field, and anyone who's dealt with lots of data knows this. It's sort of I think the elephant in the room is that 90% of all effort goes into basically cleaning the data up, right, and putting it into a form where it can be even begin to be visualized or analyzed or incorporated into a model, and that's a problem. I view that as a real opportunity for developing foundational principles in either automating or at the very least providing tools that could be used to go between all the common formats and federate data into whatever format the user considers to be the most convenient for that particular user. Aggregation and integration of heterogeneous data, of course, is something that in 1996 was not as pressing a problem because the data was fairly homogeneous. You dealt with one data type at a time, and whereas now if you have to integrate behavioral data with satellite measurements and traffic embedded sensors for designing an evacuation route, that's an incredible number of sources that you have to deal with to come up with an adequate representation of the data that's relevant to designing this evacuation scheme. So that is the last thing up here that I want to mention is the need for including sort of human collaboration all across this pipeline. So human input is required so that one doesn't fall in the trap of building a pipeline that works today but fails to work tomorrow. Like if you all may recall Google Flu. How many in this room recall Google Flu? Not many, but yeah, that was a very bold experiment by Google Corporation to scrape the Google the clicks on web pages for flu medications and other types of user-generated queries that could be reasonably associated with the outbreak of flu. So someone, asks about symptoms, someone queries about the nearest pharmacy, and all this was put into a analytic engine, as they called it, to predict next season's flu, or even the flu for the next week. And this worked for about 2 years, and then it failed miserably because the model wasn't updated. And people just had different ways of expressing their interest. People heard of Google Flu, and there was also a bias of the type where one calls an intervention bias. So when people heard about Google Flu, they got more interested in querying because they were worried that maybe they were going to get the flu. It was all around the news, and it therefore was a characteristic case where you needed updating along the pipeline. All right, so that's sort of the parameters, if you like, of where we need to be looking in developing foundational principles and algorithms for handling this massive, highly varied, and high velocity and limited certainty, limited reliability of data that we collect.
This is a human intervention.
Yes.
You have about 10 minutes.
Thank you. So with that, I will adjust my talk accordingly. This just lists sort of a grouping that we at Michigan have identified as places where we want to invest into developing foundational principles for visualization. A lot of this investment comes from the fact that this is both areas which are very important for data science and for the pipeline, as I was discussing before, but also it represents sort of some of the competencies that we have on campus. So we might not have put some of these on the list if we didn't have people that we could identify who could actually be invested in to develop methods. Visualization, basically machine learning types of tools, mathematical tools for temporal multi-scale models with statistical models to handle uncertainty and provenance issues. Then integration problems that I mentioned several times for streaming data, structured both and unstructured. Preparation, provenance tracking, as I mentioned, very important to minimize that 90% of effort to something more reasonable. And then data privacy and cybersecurity, which I haven't mentioned here and really won't mention too much in the future, which I think is a really important area that we are investing in that also includes issues such as fairness and ethics, which as we have an increasing amount of let me say, voluntary and involuntary surveillance on our data becomes an issue of to what extent can we depend upon consent, the primary guiding principle of ethical research behavior, consenting subjects for any types of research that might be done on them, and that could be by companies for throwing out people that might become high-paying customers, or for scientific research on flu or what have you, with challenge studies on large populations. There's an enormous issue here of the principles that need to be developed to ensure that data that's collected for one purpose from a population, which is consented to that purpose, be used responsibly and not reused for a different purpose or combined with other data that can be used to identify an individual to the extent to which their privacy would be breached. So I'm now going to talk about, in the last 5 to 7 minutes I have left, the sort of interdisciplinary nature of this enterprise of developing foundational principles for complex data. So, right on the top of my list is mathematics, which really is the tool that we have that can enable us to develop representations of data as objects that have some kind of geometry, right? And that can be manipulated using mathematical methods, some of which are listed here, to gather insights about the nature of the data, the geometric properties of data that might be highly variable, but confined to some space like a Euclidean plane or an orbit around that plane, and use geometry to sort of intuit that we have data with this that has this structure, even though we can't visualize it. We can visualize it if we only have 3 data dimensions. But as I mentioned before, with complex data, you might have hundreds or thousands or millions of dimensions, so you can't actually say that the data looks like this. And why might you be interested? Well, because if it does look like this, you know that, for example, you don't have to be looking for data in places where it might not occur, so you can save on your search complexity, or you can save on your computation complexity by focusing in on the properties of the data that you know exist. You can define those geometrically, then you're able to reduce the universe of conversation about the data that you then enter into with computer scientists who can develop fast and reliable, scalable algorithms that can handle data that comes in the form of a graph or a list that may have some aspects of semantical meaning through some natural language, and for which you can start to bring in issues of privacy and security in terms of anonymization of the data and summarization of the data in such a way that it doesn't reveal, if it's disseminated to some third party, it doesn't reveal identities of individuals who have graciously offered their data to the data aggregator. And then statistics, as I said before, is a third component where the data is viewed as a random sample where there might be missing elements of that data. There may be aspects of design of experiments where you want to determine which types of data sources you want to go to get your information about the behaviors of drivers as they try to evacuate a given region. Are there records of purchasing coffee at Starbucks? Is that relevant? No, probably not, right? But telematics coming from their insurance providers about their driving habits might be, right? To tell you if they tend to drive fast, if they tend to drive erratically, or just as an experimental design can provide ways to determine which types of data are most important. The robust procedures are necessary in order to handle any uncertainty about that might exist about the noise or confidence one has in that data. And then information science deals with the human-computer interface, right? The human-computer interaction visualization process and workflow that includes people looking at data or intermediate summaries of data, curation of that data so that it's easily accessible 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. I can no longer read the data I generated as a graduate student. It's on a PDP-11 readable magnetic tape. And that's not that far long ago. It's only 30 years. Of course, engineering is all about designing the pipeline and making sure that we can provide a reliable communication and control of our data collection mechanism. And so all of the aspects of real-time computing, cybersecurity, and the components that go into designing communications links for accessing data and signal processing for pulling data off of wearable device sensors or other types of sensors and combining them with operations engineering, which can tell us how to best schedule those sensor measurement time or in time or in space. And then finally, physics has played a very important role in providing fundamental underlying principles for data that are based on an analogy to statistical physics, continuum mechanics, multi-scale modeling, multi-scale systems, and then even proposing algorithms or sort of artificial physics laws that can be used to better identify clusters in, for example, co-author networks like Mark Newman has been doing at Michigan in the physics department. So that sort of gives an overview of the 6 of the important disciplines that play into, in my opinion, the training of the next generation of data scientists. And then I will now conclude skipping my examples with a lot of math in it, which probably you wouldn't want to have seen anyway at this time of day with lunch sort of beckoning us. But I will conclude with just sort of a summary of what I've said, that we're facing this information this explosion that is transforming many academic disciplines. We're all looking for ways to develop new courses, new ways of collaborating together, to use data in such a way to improve our scientific state of knowledge or improve delivery of services in social services, for example, by using different types of survey data. And societal demands are not going to decrease. There's certainly privacy and security issues are going to loom very large over the next few years. They already are looming very large. And most, according to surveys, there's only about 30% of people surveyed, this is by the Pew Research Institute, trust their service providers to keep their own data private, which is a pretty low number. And then finally, the ubiquity of data that's accessible across geographical boundaries in the cloud and mobile solutions can certainly introduces another dimension into our constraints on how we compute with data, how we collect data, and how we draw inferences from the data that we do collect. So with that, I will conclude my talk.
All right, speaker. I mean, perhaps we can entertain one quick question. I'm sure many people have a lot of questions, but Mahmood? No.
In your opinion, should the 21st century pipeline for data processing include some provisions for intelligence at the data acquisition point?
Definitely. I mean, that is one of my main messages. In fact, and you've stated it in a clear way. One cannot simply live with the data that one has. One has to look at collecting data that's relevant to the decision one wants to make. And to do that, you have to incorporate the intelligence that accounts for what the final use of that data is going to be into the collection process. There's just too many sources of data to be able to do everything simultaneously. So we need some intelligent mechanisms in this pipeline to do data selection or data source selection as part of this integrated processing and sensing and interpretation pipeline. So I would say emphatically yes.
How would you do that, at the sensor level or?
Well, this is why in that diagram that I showed, there's constant feedback across all those layers. So one would do, for example, it depends on the sensor. I mean, if you're looking at a sensor that is energy limited, and that you therefore only want to turn on when you take your data, and you have a whole set of these sensors that covers some given area, you have to decide on which sensors to keep asleep and which sensors to wake up, right? Based on your objective of, say, tracking traffic patterns in the evacuation problem I was just mentioning, right? You can't afford to use all sensors at once. You have to intelligently, using algorithms, predictive algorithms, that can predict the value that a particular sensor will give if you wake it up, given all the information you've collected thus far on, say, where the traffic pattern seems to be going, right? So certainly you need to have intelligence at the sensor.
I think perhaps we should close the session here. But before we go, I just wanted to present to Professor Al Hero just a very simple token of our appreciation for him being here. It's a plaque. Let me read this. Presented to Alfred O. Hero III in appreciation for your information science and technology, ISTEC Distinguished Lecture, Colorado State University, October 17, 2016.
Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Now, just a quick announcement. Professor Hero's talk at 2 p.m. this afternoon, a more technical talk on continuum limits, will be in Clark A204, 2 p.m.